guys, I hope you're having a great week. This is the first week in February. So does anybody know what we celebrate in February? There's a lot of holidays, but it's a certain month of the year. We call it Black History Month. Now, we talk about lots of different composers, especially this past in January, this past month. But this month, I want to focus on specifically Black musicians, people who have been people of color, men and women, who have influenced music in different capacities. So some are going to be composers, some may be singers or other types of performers. And the first one for this week we're going to talk about is Duke Ellington. Has anybody heard of Duke Ellington? He's maybe not a name that you would recognize, but you may have heard some of his music in the past. So Duke Ellington is one of the most prominent jazz musician composers. He was classically trained. So like when we talked about Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald in the past, he kind of was in that same time frame, but he wasn't a singer. He composed a lot of music. So he wrote a lot of music, and he was known for being a pianist, like he played piano, and he was also a conductor. Okay, so let's talk about him. So the name Duke Ellington, Duke, that's actually a nickname for him. His first name was actually Edward Kennedy Ellington. He got the nickname Duke because his parents raised him to have really good manners, and he hung out with a lot of older people who had really good manners. So he kind of carried himself in a very stately, gentlemanly way. And so some of his friends nicknamed him Duke, and that just kind of stuck. So Duke Ellington was born in 1899, okay, right before the turn of the century. And then he passed away in May of 1974. So he was 75 years old when he passed away. That was a good long life, and he did a lot of really cool things. In fact, when Duke Ellington was a kiddo, he grew up in Washington, D.C. area. Now, you guys probably know that Washington, D.C. is where the White House is, right? Where the president lives, and a lot of major political stuff happens there. Now, the cool thing, well, one of the cool things about Duke Ellington, so he and his parents, they lived near his mother's his grandparents, his mother's parents, and they were all independently, maybe not wealthy, but they had jobs and did pretty well for themselves. They had their own homes. But one interesting thing is Duke Ellington's grandparents, so Duke's mother's parents, they were actually American slaves. Yeah. We're not that far removed from a time of slavery. So these wonderful individuals, his grandparents, moved to Washington, D.C. They moved up north after the Civil War when they were freed, and they kind of made a life for themselves. So Duke was like a second generation in there. He was a free man, and so were his parents, but he kind of could draw on the experience of his grandparents, which is kind of crazy to think about. But so he grew up and he went to school. He went to high school. By the way, this is a picture of him, Mr. Duke Ellington. This is later in his life. But so as he was growing up, he really liked baseball. His mom really tried to get him to play piano and take piano lessons, and he actually missed more lessons than he attended. He liked music, but his first love was actually baseball. And he tells some stories, like in his memoirs, in his history. He recalls the president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt, would ride his horse up and watch him and his friends play baseball. That's kind of crazy. So Duke Ellington, his first job was actually selling peanuts at baseball games. Crazy. And then he was a soda jerk for a while, and that's not a term we use very often, but there used to be these things called soda fountains, kind of like little diners. Sometimes they were attached to pharmacies, and my grandpa was actually a soda jerk. And those people would make drinks for people, so milkshakes and like a Coca-Cola, and you could sit and hang out there. And so Duke Ellington was a soda jerk, and he actually wrote his very first composition. So his first song written was about being a soda jerk, but he couldn't read or write music at the time, so it was all written in his head by ear. and he would improv. He would kind of make it up as he goes. And so every time he played the song, it was just a little bit different, which is interesting. So in the summers, Duke Ellington would travel with his mom to like the New England area, upstate New York, and he would observe other musicians, like street performers, who would play lots of different like jazz sounding music. But back then, if you could read music, that was great, but a lot of sheet music was very expensive. It was kind of expensive to print. So he would watch as these performers, if they had sheet music, they would play it so much that they knew it by heart, and then they would find ways to improv and change it. So they would actually flip the sheet music completely upside down and read it upside down and see if it was a different song. And obviously it sounded totally different. And he kind of took that idea of improvisation and using what you have as he would create his own music. So he would have summer lessons. His mom would have him work with a band teacher. He finally learned to read and write sheet music. So cool. And that helped as he was starting to develop his own style. Now, Duke Ellington graduated high school, and then he was in college, and he only had about 3 months left of college when he dropped out because he wanted to be a sign painter. Now, today, we don't necessarily use sign painters the same way. You can easily print up signs. You go to a print shop, but sometimes you'll pay people to like write on windows. You'll see like someone's painting a really pretty design on a window somewhere, or if you wanted a handmade sign, those were designed by someone, and that's what Duke Ellington did as his day job. And it's kind of funny, he would go to his day job and he'd interact with people who were paying him to make signs for events, and he would kind of drum up business, and he'd say, hey, me and my friends play music, do you have any entertainment for this event? And that's how he would get some of his first gigs. So he gathered some of his friends who were musicians, and they would play music together for these events. His first paying gig only brought home 75 cents. Isn't that crazy? Such a small amount of money. But he was very good, and though he was a little bit discouraged and he was their own booking agent, they didn't have someone doing that for him, he loved it, and he was very, very talented. But you got to remember, there's this thing at the time called segregation, and that's where they kept people of different skin colors totally separate. So you wouldn't usually see white people and African American people all in the same concerts, all in the same venues, performing together. That wasn't common. And it's sad, but that's really how it was. And one of the cool things with Duke Ellington is that even though in the United States most of his following was African American, at least at the beginning, they went and toured eventually once it got popular. They went and toured all over Europe, and they had integrated audiences, which was kind of unique. That still wasn't very common. So when they came back to the United States, they started recording records with other musicians and performers. He worked with lots of people. Like I was mentioning Ella Fitzgerald. They did several pieces together. One of the songs you're going to listen to today, she is singing her traditional jazz scat sound, and he's playing piano, and they're playing with his big band. And so once television became popular, that was one of the big things for them. They would perform live with their big band. Big band music was kind of this idea of taking an orchestra and smushing it down to be way smaller with less performers, but they could still play a lot of kind of jazz meets classical music. And their style was really influenced by the Harlem Renaissance. We'll probably talk about that at some point, but it was an area of New York that was predominantly black, and they had this big, huge thing happen in like the 1920s to 30s, where all of these performers who had these great skills and abilities worked together to have their own movement of music. And then the bluesy sounding horns and the New Orleans style jazz all influenced their style. So one cool thing with Duke Ellington, whenever he conducted, so whether it was a piece of music that he wrote or he was just getting his band together to perform, he would lead the band not with a baton like you would traditionally think of with a conductor. He would conduct while playing piano. He would just use facial expressions and certain musical cues and nods and his body language to help conduct and keep the orchestra playing together, which is kind of cool. So they did tons of tours. He actually wrote some film scores, some music for movies. And this is really one of the coolest things to me. Duke Ellington was presented later in his life, in 1969, with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And at the time, it's like the highest civilian or normal person honor in the United States. So that's a big deal. But at the time, he was the very first African American and the first jazz musician to receive that honor, which is really kind of cool and very special. So today you're going to listen to a couple pieces by him, and you're going to see his orchestra. One is a black and white filmed section with him and Ella Fitzgerald together performing. They're going to do Don't Mean a Thing If You Ain't Got Swing, and it's a pretty famous piece. And then another one that's just instrumental, but much later. So it was right before it was in 1962. So it's in a color TV. It would have been live on television. And that's a song called Satin Doll. And you can kind of see his directing style, and you're going to notice that his orchestra, not only is that video color, it's also integrated. So they had both black and white musicians, which is really, really cool. So I hope you enjoy, and let's watch those videos. Bye, guys.